Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, bonjour à tous, bienvenue à cette deuxième journée de Remember 75+. Nous allons aujourd'hui commencer avec une conférence de quelqu'un qui nous vient d'Allemagne. Le professeur Stephan Lehnstaedt est enseignant au Touro College à Berlin, donc c'est une université où il enseigne l'histoire de la Shoah, bien entendu. C'est un homme qui s'est spécialisé dans la Seconde Guerre mondiale, dans l'étude des ghettos, et qui est ici pour aujourd'hui nous parler de son travail sur l'action Reinhardt. Alors, l'action Reinhardt, qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est l'extermination des Juifs de Pologne par les nazis dans les centres dits d'extermination pure, parce que ce sont des centres où il n'y avait rien d'autre que l'extermination. Donc, c'est essentiellement les noms de Belzec, Sobibor et Treblinka qui sont connus dans ce contexte, ou moins connus justement, parce que d'un point de vue belge, c'est surtout Auschwitz qui est connu, parce que la plupart des gens qui ont été déportés de Malines ont été déportés vers Auschwitz et assassinés à Auschwitz. Donc ces autres noms, on les entend de temps à autre, mais on ne les connaît finalement pas tellement bien, on ne sait pas tellement bien ce qu'il y a derrière. Et donc, le but, c'est un peu de faire un historique des 30 années de recherche sur cette action Reinhardt, depuis le travail pionnier en 1987 de Yitzhak Arad. Il y a beaucoup de choses qui ont été découvertes depuis, il y avait beaucoup de choses à mentionner, et Stephan Lehnstaedt l'a fait. Dus vandaag allen hartelijk welkom voor deze tweede dag van Remember 75+. We gaan vandaag van start met een conferentie, een lezing van professor Dr Stephan Lehnstaedt. Hij komt uit Berlijn, hij is leerkracht aan het Touro College in Berlijn. Een universitair niveau van Holocaust Studies. Hij is gespecialiseerd in de Tweede Wereldoorlog, in de studie van de ghetto's, maar komt ons vandaag vooral onderhouden over Aktion Reinhardt. Aktion Reinhardt was de uitroeiing van de Poolse Joden in Polen zelf, dus in het generaal gouvernement, zoals de nazi's het noemden, in de uitroeiingscentra, en daar is het belangrijk van centrum te zeggen, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Er waren een 30-tal jaar verlopen sinds het pionierswerk van Yitzhak Arad in 1987. En het is Stephan Lehnstaedt dat samenvattend historisch werk heeft gemaakt. De publicaties bestaan in het Nederlands en in het Frans. U ziet hier het Franstalige exemplaar. En in Nederland is bij de Holocaustbibliotheek van Verboom het Nederlandstalige exemplaar beschikbaar sinds min of meer een jaar. Dus wie meer wilt weten over Aktion Reinhardt, over de uitroeiing van de Joden buiten Auschwitz in feite, want dat is toch wel wat dat in België vooral gekend is, moet deze zeker in zijn bibliotheek hebben en profiteren ervan, want vandaag is Stephan Lehnstaedt erbij om ze te handtekenen indien u dat wenst. Donc profitez-en parce qu'aujourd'hui Stephan Lehnstaedt est présent pour les signer si tel est votre désir. Herr Professor Dr. Lehnstaedt, bitte.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for having me here. It's a great honor, and you see, I will speak to you in English because my school French is a little rusty and I unfortunately never learned Dutch, so English it will be. And I will start with Treblinka, a quiet place far from any traffic or tourist routes, about 80 kilometers northeast of Warsaw. In the dense pine forests, nothing betrays the horrific events that took place there almost 75 years ago. On July the 22nd in 1942, the German occupiers began deporting Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to be gassed in the Treblinka extermination camp. By November 1943, they had murdered almost 900,000 people from the ghettos in occupied Poland, burned the bodies and buried the ashes. Today, a small memorial, a monument, and a symbolic railway line commemorate the Holocaust. The only traces of the mass murder are the trees. They are the last legacies of the murderers. The forest was planted so that nothing would be visible, so that grass would actually grow over the matter, if you like. During the Holocaust, the Germans systematically murdered Jews, or more precisely, people they considered to be Jews. In the extermination camps of Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka, all located in occupied Poland. They did so from spring 1942 onwards under the cover name of Aktion Reinhardt, and the victims came mainly from the general government of Poland and the Białystok district, but also from other countries of conquered Europe. Almost 500,000 people died in Belzec, almost 200,000 in Sobibór, and some 900,000 in Treblinka. If we add up all the dead, that is, those who died during the roundup in the ghettos or on the deportation trains, we arrive at least 1.8 million, perhaps even more. We will never exactly know all their names, and we will never be able to determine their exact number, because the murders covered their tracks quite effectively. And this is another reason why Aktion Reinhardt is hardly known today, despite its dimensions. This is all the more remarkable as Aktion Reinhardt represents the actual core of the Holocaust, the almost complete extermination of the Polish Jews, the murder of nearly 2 million people with almost no visible traces. A monstrous deed which today does not reveal itself in a gigantic camp complex for tens of thousands of forced laborers as in Auschwitz, but precisely in its non-existence, Aktion Reinhardt is the quintessence of racial hatred and German anti-Semitism. It was the pure extermination without any other benefit. On the Polish Jews, the Germans deployed their anti-Semitic program into genocide from September 1939 onwards. The industrial mass murder that began in spring 1942 was not invented in Auschwitz, but in and for Belzec. Thereafter, highly motivated perpetrators gradually perfected killing methods. There was, however, no master plan for genocide. It was possible because the German leadership agreed to exterminate the Jews. Camp commanders like Christian Wirth or Franz Stangl had trains with up to 5,000 people crammed into cattle cars, emptied in a matter of hours. They herded the victims into gas chambers that functioned as simply as they did, brutally efficiently, with engine exhaust. But the real challenge for the murderers was the disposal of the bodies. Where the gas chambers killed 2,000 people in almost 20 minutes, burying them in mass graves took much longer. The pits with half-decomposed bodies emitted an infernal stench, and even worse, they provided inevitable proof of the crime. From the end of 1942, the bodies were therefore dug up and burned on huge pyres. Once again, the murder experts were highly satisfied with their simple solutions. Initially, there are very few photos from Belzec. We have only 4 from Treblinka. We have a photo album with which is commonly referred to as Beautiful Times, because this was Schöne Zeiten was what the SS titled one series of photos inside the album. And then we have from Sobibór the album of the perpetrator Johann Niemann, and I think you have it already, at least in Dutch. Also as a book. But both albums actually don't show the murder process, and they show no victims, so the crime scenes are clean, if you like. Aktion Reinhardt proves the smooth cooperation of conscienceless perpetrators with ordinary men of the civil administration, the railway, or the police, who sent the Jews from the ghettos to extermination without a second thought. The SS and police leader Odilo Globocnik controlled this network from Lublin. A network, moreover, that shows very clearly why the Holocaust was a crime committed by Germans and by Austrians. Globocnik was born in Trieste on April the 21st, 1904. His family came, so Trieste at that time was part of Austria-Hungary. His family came from the Upper Carniola, and contrary to what the name suggests, his ancestors were of German descent and thoroughly nationalist, which is why they moved to Carinthia after the war and after the First World War and after the defeat of the Central Powers, because they did not want to live in a non-German country. For even as a schoolboy, the young Odilo took already part in the so-called Volkstumskampf, which is the ethnic struggle or later racial struggle. In 1931, he finally joined the Austrian Nazi Party, which, as you know, was not only active in Germany, and he remained loyal to it after it was legally banned in 1933, again in Austria. After the Anschluss, Hitler appointed Globocnik as Gauleiter of Vienna in May 1938. But here, the always ambitious Globocnik proved not to be up to the task. He acted very casually, he tried to settle things unofficially, and mostly relied on his old connections and networks. And moreover, he also regarded his official financial resources as private assets. And he gave interest-free loans to friends, he speculated in real estate with losses, and he personally enriched himself with the money extorted from the Vienna Jews. In view of the near bankruptcy of the Gau, Globocnik had to leave in January 1939. But Globocnik had made a friend in Heinrich Himmler, who really appreciated Globocnik's brutal measures against the Vienna Jews. And Himmler appointed Globocnik as SS and police leader in Lublin in November 1939. Globocnik now set about radicalizing the Volkstumskampf in the East, which was familiar to him from Carinthia, and he radicalized it to the point of genocide. He again relied on an established network of old comrades from Austria, whom he brought with him to the East. His most important comrade in arms was Hermann Höfle, born in Salzburg in 1911. Globocnik made him chief of staff of Aktion Reinhardt, and Höfle's task was to organize the deportations of the Jews to the extermination camps. And Höfle was to prove himself as a brilliant organizer. The same was true for Christian Wirth from Württemberg, who supervised the 3 camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Bauschitz. He also ensured the necessary transfer of the murder techniques and personnel from the former euthanasia action to the East, because before his move to Poland, he had been the inspector of all the establishments of this murder program. He had ensured the bureaucratic handling of euthanasia, he issued forged death certificates, he arranged the camouflage to the outside world, and he selected helpers and supervised the murder procedures personally. And so doctors and staff from psychiatric sanatoria had killed around 70,000 patients. in close cooperation with the police. More precisely, they had murdered them in gas chambers in which carbon monoxide was released from bottles. The victims died of carbon monoxide poisoning. This key technology of the Holocaust was developed for the murder of mentally ill people. The perpetrators then sent to Poland had learned from euthanasia, and they formed a well-rehearsed team that was then responsible for running the death camps. No one had to be forced to murder. On the contrary, the former policemen and helpers in the psychiatric installations they worked out of conviction, and they had no interest in giving up their activities. And this was especially true for the commanders of the Aktion Reinhardt centers. Franz Stangl, for example, was a policeman, and from 1940 to 1942 was employed in the euthanasia institutions at Hartheim and Bernburg as head of administration. Stangl then became the first commander in Sobibor for 6 months and was then sent to Treblinka to take over the management there. He thus replaced, in Treblinka, Irmfried Ebel, Dr. Irmfried Ebel, who was a good acquaintance to Stangl. As a doctor, Ebel had been the medical director of the euthanasia hospitals Brandenburg and later Bernburg, and had worked there with Stangl. However, Irmfried Ebel was unable to cope with the organization of the extermination machinery in Treblinka and had to be sent back to Germany. Stangl was simply the more efficient murderer. In Sobibor, his friend and deputy from Hartheim, Franz Reichleitner, also a criminal police officer, followed him. Reichleitner, Stangl, and Ebel came from Austria and had had similar experiences to Globocnik in the Nazi party there. So here you have it, a network. They all know themselves. The precise organization by these perpetrators allowed for only about 20 Germans to murder in each of the camps. They were able to fall back on former prisoners of war of the Red Army, assembled in a unit usually called Travniki men, and of those, John or Ivan Demjanjuk in Sobibor achieved the greatest notoriety. This division of labor against the Jews, together with the oppressed people of Europe, is a central aspect of the Holocaust. It was possible because in the end, no one protested. The cries of the victims went unheard, although the events were well observed. There are numerous reports by Jewish, Polish, and German resistance fighters, but there are also exemplary testimonies from ordinary soldiers, from men and women passing through, who witnessed this public secret of a genocide. Details remained hidden from them, but they often estimated the dimensions of the murder program with astonishing precision. The few survivors report on the horrors in the camps themselves. They describe despair and the will to persevere and find words for the unimaginable, for the speechless. Whereas in Auschwitz, selections took place which separated those ostensibly fit for work from those doomed to die, which means candidates for slave labor, for inhumane, pseudo-scientific medical experiments, and which also enabled the SS to run a comprehensively economic operation. This is Auschwitz, but Aktion Reinhardt only required a very small number of slave laborers doomed to die anyway, and they were required for the processing of the Jews from the deportation trains. In the eyes of the perpetrators, there was no use no use at all that the victims could still have. Even their robbery was only a byproduct to help to cover expenses, because camp construction costs money, railway trains don't run for free, and on a personal level, obviously, there was also many opportunities for enrichment. So the perpetrators robbed the Jews of everything, and I'm now quoting the survivor Richard Glazar. It is unbelievable what the last luggage of thousands and thousands consists of. A small case, equipped like a laboratory, a foldable leather bag containing locksmith tools, various locking hooks, a set of hypodermic syringes with a shiny container for boiling, a huge junk shop in which everything is present except life. The wind whirls up smaller pieces, paper money, greenish Polish zlotys, Russian rubles, German marks, American dollars, precious stones and gold, valuables easy to take on the run, a small heart of gold with a necklace. On top, a red feather bed with brown diarrhea stains sits a black rabbi's cap. Next to it, prosthetic legs, a child's crutch. The selection criteria for prisoners in Belgrade, Sobibor and Treblinka were as simple as can be. Apart from a few specialists, some kitchen helpers or doctors for the immediate camp operations, Globocnik men really only needed strong men who could dig graves and carry corpses. The later men were housed in the so-called death area of the camps, and they had no contact with the other part of this camp. There, in turn, were no Jews who had to provide services, so to speak, apart from the aforementioned doctors, who also cared for Germans and Travniki men, and some Jewish cooks. The perpetrators needed people to sort and pack the looted objects. When a new train stopped at the ramp, they sometimes looked for carpenters, for tailors, for furriers or goldsmiths to do some specialist work. But among the 2,000 people who had gathered on the ramp, usually only a few came forward, and the SS selected from them even more. And one had to be very lucky to be picked and to survive, especially since no one was spared, since often no one was spared on the transport. More than 500 prisoners rarely worked in one of the 3 death camps at the same time. Those whom the camp staff did not drive directly into the gas chambers, they had to learn quickly. Richard Glazar, whom I just quoted, a Jewish foreman, it was explained by a Jewish foreman on his arrival at Treblinka. And I quote, "After 2 or 3 days, if you will still be alive, and you come to me, you will know that there is everything in Treblinka, everything, except life." And very similar was the introduction Samuel Willenberg received. There is nothing here at all, not even life. You are in Treblinka, the biggest shit heap of a camp ever. Have you noticed that they haven't shaved our heads? Nobody cares. It's not a labor camp or a concentration camp. It's just a gigantic extermination camp, a genocidal operation. The prisoners were constantly confronted with death, that of family members and friends, that of strangers, and as a constant threat, their own death. But they could not afford to pause in their work, otherwise they would be beaten by the Germans and the Travnikis, or immediately be shot. Mordechai Goldfarb reports on the abuse in Sobibor, which was also part of everyday life in the other 2 camps. And I quote Goldfarb, "And they beat me with a whip that had lead in the end. and cut into the flesh. My brother fell off the board unconscious, covered in blood, but I endured it. I counted to 75. They hurt me to the most because I was the master and responsible for the rest of the painters. For 8 weeks I couldn't sit down. Dull and sad tasks were what fell to the lucky ones who survived the immediate arrival at the camp. After the war, many of them gave such impressive accounts of it that the torment speaks from every word. They wrote about how they watched the extermination of hundreds and thousands. Berek Freiberg, for instance, had to cut the hair of the victims in Sobibor before they went into the gas chambers, because the Germans needed even the hairs as valuable raw material for their industry. And I quote Freiberg, "There were 20 shearers who cut the women's hair. When the women came in naked and saw the men in the room, they wanted to withdraw. But the Germans wouldn't let them and beat them so that they had to sit down naked. I was one of the shearers. It took about half a minute to shear a head. We took the long hair and cut it off quickly, leaving patches and patches of hair on the head. There were no limits to what the Germans could do to the Jews. Excessive, completely unprovoked and sadistic violence was constantly practiced. A typical example from Sobibor is described again by Mordechai Goldfarb. The deputy commander Gustav Wagner had sent Goldfarb to fetch paint from a magazine, but Wagner was an impatient man and he did not want to wait. So he ran to the depot himself, where Goldfarb already had some buckets of paint in his hand. But Wagner punched him violently in the face and angrily insulted him. And I quote, "Then he ran away, but he could not calm down, returned and shouted the same thing again and hit again. This went on until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, to get the paint we had left in the morning. So Wagner raced out of the barrack and returned, and each time he hit us, then he cried with rage and hit again. Our blood mixed with the paint. Then he shouted that he didn't want to see us and sent us to unload 3 wagons of gravel. He gave me the biggest bucket and set his dog, called Barry, on me. The dog tore my clothes to pieces and jumped between my legs. That's what he was trained to do. The next day, I didn't notice Wagner approaching and didn't take off my cap in front of him. He approached me and gave me such a kick that I suffered a hernia." The camp inmates were so overwhelmed by the feeling of total hopelessness that they continued to describe it in their memoirs for many years after the war. Yet, it is precisely these memoirs that bear witness to the unconditional will to survive. After all, the Germans had not been able to murder their authors. Despite the brutal efficiency of Aktion Reinhardt, there were always escapes and there always was resistance. The perpetrators had to constantly reckon with being attacked by the Jews. Wirth's method in Belzec to have the deportation trains unload and opened only by prisoners testifies to this. In fact, attacks on the ramp were not that rare. The many deceptive maneuvers, from orchestral music to gas chambers disguised as baths, also testify to the fear of this self-proclaimed master race. It is remarkable to what ingenuity the not so passive victims displayed in attacking the highly armed SS men and their Traveliki aides with the simplest means. They were well aware that resistance under these circumstances was always tantamount to a death sentence, and also exposed their fellow prisoners to collective punishment. Nevertheless, they rebelled. In Treblinka, for example, Meyer Berliner stabbed the SS man Max Biala to death in the roll call area on September 11, 1942. And those who did not resist tried to escape. Only very few, however, succeeded. And besides, escape was not yet salvation. The occupation, with its brutal persecution of the Jews, was far too oppressive for that. Abraham Krzepicki's story clearly proves this. After the Germans had deported him from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka in late August 1942, he actually managed to escape from there, together with 3 fellow prisoners, some 18 days later. On that day, Krzepicki and his comrades had to load freight wagons with looted clothing. The 4 escapees hid under a mountain of coats, which the SS did not notice. They traveled a few kilometers by train and then jumped off. Krzepicki returned to Warsaw a few weeks later to testify and to warn other Jews in the ghetto. In Warsaw, however, Krzepicki also had to discover that there was no trace of his 3 friends who fled with him. For the 25-year-old Zionist, the conclusion from this experience was clear. The Jews had to resist. He thus joined the Jewish combat organization, the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, and took part in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. This uprising may have seemed hopeless, a desperate act without any real chance of success, but it once again sent out that all-important signal: Jews would not be led like sheep to the slaughter. At least that was the impression the uprising gave to the perpetrators as well as to the victims. And that is why Jews in Treblinka and Sobibor joined forces and resisted. In Treblinka, the uprising on August 2nd, 1943 was rather random and not very well organized. In Sobibor, on October 14th, 1943, the rebellion broke out with almost military precision and planning. Leon Feldhendler had been able to win over Alexander Peczerski as the military leader of his resistance movement at the end of September 1943. Peczerski, a Red Army lieutenant, had arrived with a deportation train from the occupied Soviet territories and had plenty of combat experience. Their plan, the plan by Peczerski and Feldhendler, was quite captivating. Within an hour, kill as many Germans as possible, and then move on to an open revolt, and finally a mass escape. After extensive preparations, they strike on October 14th, 1943. A date on which several SS men, and including the commander Franz Reichländer, are absent. They actually, the Jews, they actually want to start at 4 p.m., but Untersturmführer Johann Niemann shows up at the tailor's shop a quarter of an hour earlier, where he had ordered a new uniform. He takes off his jacket and his gun, and Alexander Shubayev kills him with an axe. It's the first gun that falls into the hands of the prisoners, and more will follow. The commander of the death area, Anton Getzinger, appears punctually at 4 p.m. in the cobbler's workshop because there are supposedly nice new boots for him. He dies by an axe blow, as does Siegfried Gretschus 10 minutes later, who has fallen for a similar trick. At 4:30, more Germans and the first Travniki men are dead. The telephone lines from the camp are cut, and the blacksmith Shlomo Schmeiner has managed to drag a few rifles out of the Travniki barracks in drain pipes. Until 5:30, everything goes as planned. Even most of the inmates do not yet know what is going on, because all the inmates are supposed to escape united through the main gate, the capos sound the roll call early. Pechersky gives a short speech in Russian in which he informs the prisoners about the situation, calls on them to retaliate, and promises rescue by the Red Army through the victory of the Soviet Union. Feldhandler translates into Yiddish, and the cheers are great. But now the first shots are fired. The SS man Erich Bauer had returned early from a trip and found the dead Rudolf Beckmann in the commandant's office. He started shooting wildly. Fortunately, the Travnikis on the watchtowers are not yet aware, and they are unsuspecting simply because shooting is part of everyday life in Sobibor. Only slowly do they realize what is happening and also open fire. By that time, the mass of prisoners streams to the main gate, some of them engaged in a wild shootout with Germans and Travnikis, others storming the armory, but they have to move on, disappointed because rifles were being cleaned and disassembled. The gate is fiercely defended. There are many dead among the prisoners. A small group therefore tries to climb over the fence some distance away, but a minefield has been set up on the other side. Explosions can be heard, body parts whirl through the air, and the chaos is perfect. Elsewhere in Camp 1, people are smarter. The barbed wire is torn down with swings and spades, and the mines are blown up with the help of wooden planks. The breakthrough was finally successful at both points, and the inmates streamed to freedom in a hail of bullets. The insurgents were able to kill 11 SS men and 10 Travniki. And although in Treblinka and Sobibor only a good 60 prisoners each ultimately survived the breakout, they set a signal. The perpetrators were now afraid of the victims. They no longer continued the genocide in the camps of Aktion Reinhard, but now only in Auschwitz. Survivors like Teuvi Blatt and Philipp Jałowicz from Sobibor, or Gil Reichmann and Samuel Willenberg from Treblinka did everything they could after 1945 to bring the murderers to justice. But it was not until the 1960s that the police and judiciary in Germany were willing to systematically initiate investigations and trials. Also, because of the testimonies of the former camp inmates, there was something like a late justice, even if by far not all SS men received a punishment. The Belzec case proved to be especially tragic, because there were only 3 survivors at all. And only one of them, Rudolf Reider, a soap manufacturer from Lemberg, born in 1881, testified before a German court. There, the judges were of the opinion that this was not enough for a conviction, and they acquitted the defendants. And if you like, Belzec is the example of a perfect crime, the murder of 500,000 people without any punishment. And this is only the most depressing example of the Holocaust's aftermath. As early as 1944, immediately after the Red Army marched through, numerous Poles went to the former campsites and began to literally ransack them in search of hidden valuables. It was the golden harvest after the genocide, which the newly formed People's Republic was powerless to stop. Although, at the same time, dedicated public prosecutors were conducting extensive investigations into German crime. But these Polish investigations came to nothing. Neither was Germany interested, and nor was Poland able to catch the perpetrators without Western cooperation. In Germany and all around the world, Auschwitz stands symbolically for the murder of the Jews. The Germans killed over 1 million people there, more than at any other place. The entrance building of Auschwitz II with the ramp has long since become an icon. The huge area with its fences, its barracks, and remains of the gas chambers is a monument against forgetting. The crowds of visitors there are now, well, before Corona obviously, are so large that tickets have to be booked in advance. More than 1.5 million people saw the site already in 2015. On the other hand, Treblinka, the probably best known camp of Aktion Reinhardt, has an average of 100 visitors every day. Although the site is actually open to public around the clock. In Belzec, there are even fewer visits, and so is it in Sobibor. At least a new excellent museum has just been built there, and the actual campgrounds are being redesigned. Commemoration, however, has always been difficult because less than 150 people survived the extermination camps of Aktion Reinhardt. Most of them then emigrated to the US and to Israel so that they were no longer able to be involved locally. And in the Polish People's Republic, commemoration in Auschwitz and Majdanek was given priority because persecuted communists could also be commemorated there. Jewish commissions did a lot of lobbying for Treblinka as a memorial site immediately after the war, but they were unsuccessful. Instead, the communist government financed a monument to the Warsaw Ghetto resistance because it stood for heroism instead of suffering, and it was also instrumentalized against the disagreeable Warsaw Uprising of the National Conservative Home Army in 1944. The People's Republic did not erect memorials until the 1960s, and this may well be seen as a reaction to the first trials of the perpetrators in Germany at the same time. Permanent exhibitions in museums have only existed since the 2000s. In Treblinka, there are 3 rooms organized as a regional museum with a similar look and feel, and it's now being transformed into a state museum, and at the moment it looks like in 2025 there might be a new building and a new exhibition. In Belzec, the museum was completely redesigned already in 2004, and just as in Sobibor, we have there excellent exhibitions and we have really highly professional memorial work there. For the Communist People's Republic of Poland, however, the Holocaust has been forgotten in an organized way. The extermination of the Jews was being deliberately suppressed from public memory. In Germany, the situation was and is only marginally different. The criminal trials mentioned above confirm rather than refute this. And even today, there is at most a general awareness of the historical guilt of the Holocaust, which goes hand in hand with the comfortable feeling of having sufficiently confronted one's own past, of having overcome it. But when it comes to concrete knowledge, especially about Aktion Reinhardt, things look rather bleak. In Poland, the museums in Belzec and Sobibor stand in contrast to this. But as recently as 2013, the then Undersecretary of State at the German Federal Office, Cornelia Pieper, refused financial aid for the construction of a memorial in Sobibor, and she actually said, and I quote, "We were told that until now projects had been prepared with other partners, that is, with countries that were affected, that also had prisoners there. Germany was not one of them." On the part of the perpetrator nation, this is absurd in itself, but it's also factually wrong. Although the primary aim of Aktion Reinhardt was the murder of Polish Jews, Adolf Eichmann had also trains running from Western Europe to the east. And in fact, about 25,000 German and Austrian Jews were among the victims of Sobibor. Others killed there and in the two camps of Belzec and Treblinka were Jews from Greece, from Yugoslavia, from the Reich Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, so today the Czech Republic, from Slovakia, from France, and from the Netherlands, as well as from Belarus and Lithuania. About 2,000 to 5,000 Sinti and Roma were also murdered there. And this is the European dimension of this genocide, which is also widely forgotten. In the end, after several years of lobbying in Berlin, the Foreign Office gave 900,000 euros for the museum in Sobibor and also subsidized the printing of the catalogue. But Germany did not give this sum, which is actually quite modest, to be honest. And if you want to be polemically, you can speak of 5 euros per victim there. And the money was not given on its own, but Germany waited for a request from Poland. A most welcome cross-party initiative of the Bundestag's subcommittee on foreign cultural relations, which wanted to provide a total of 4 million euros already in 2016. And they wanted to give this for the Belzec Memorial, especially for Sobibor, and for a lot of educational outreach. This failed at the time due to the veto of the Budget Committee. So far, Aktion Reinhardt has no place in official commemorative policy in Germany. In many respects, this policy corresponds to the basically non-existent public interest in Aktion Reinhardt, which is also reflected in the unsatisfactory situation of research. There are no masses of visitors pressing for education and for information in Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka. And there are no survivors left who could demand an adequate remembrance. And there is no identification with the hundreds of thousands of nameless victims. Responsibility for the murderers responsibility for the murders can be attributed to a small group of German perpetrators, some of them even convicted. But there is no discussion of the implications of this genocide, which was carried out with simple methods on the one hand, and with highly efficient logistics and countless helpers on the other. This also applies to the uncomfortable fact that the events of the time were widely known, but only the Jews put up heroic resistance. Debates about one's own role in this core of the Holocaust have only been held in Poland in recent years, when the golden harvest after the liberation was discussed a few years ago. In Germany, all these events have been largely forgotten. And because the easternmost edge of the European Union is marked on German mental maps as a hopelessly poor, backwards, and deserted at best area, there is simply no attention paid to its history and to its present. Thus, even the unprecedented crime in which all the consequences of racial hatred and genocide can be seen like a burning glass, they lose their relevance. So, are the murderers celebrating success after all? Their strategy of secrecy and concealment? In fact, the absence of remains, of physical remains, makes the reconstruction of genocide more difficult. It also prevents surviving relatives from visiting a proper grave of their murdered and loved ones. Instead of individual commemoration, only the approximately localized, concreted over or overgrown ash pits exist. Moreover, Holocaust deniers often argue with the non-existence of material legacies, really following the motto, what you cannot see cannot have existed. The dismantling of the murder centers is therefore an essential part of the final solution. The Germans not only exterminated the Jews, but they also exterminated the existence of their mere existence and suffering. So, further research into Aktion Reinhardt is therefore indispensable for the preservation of memory. All of this is certainly an unpleasant outcome, but there are some glimmers of hope. These include the Polish-Israeli excavations of recent years, which, by using the most modern methods, have finally located traces of the genocide in Sobibor. They found 20,000 objects. They found the evidence of an escape tunnel by Dutch Jews, betrayed at the time. And last but not least, the foundation walls of the gas chambers. Impressive finds that are also of great scientific relevance. In addition, there is the new construction of the memorial in Sobibor, or the Polish Rabbinical Commission, which is converting mass graves of Aktion Reinhardt into Jewish burial sites. There are initiatives such as the Kassel-based Bildungswerk Stanisław Hans, which specifically bring young people from all over Europe together at the sites of Aktion Reinhardt. And most recently, the Federal Office actually financed an educational trip for people from working at German memorial sites, which we organized at Toro College, and so we went with them to Poland. However, all of these initiatives are not coordinated and, above all, continuous operations because central prerequisites are missing. On the one hand, a political declaration of interest to perpetuate these measures. And on the other hand, actually significant financial resources for commemoration, for education and for research. And this would be particularly important because the last survivors of Treblinka and Sobibor died in 2019. The central challenge of Aktion Reinhardt, which Treblinka's first chronicler Rachel Auerbach formulated already 70 years ago, now arises with even greater urgency. The world is about to start forgetting more than one event, so it's high time it got to know histories like these a little better. Thank you very much.